Mary Hunt here at Water, welcoming you to the 25th anniversary occasion celebration meeting of the Feminist Liberation Theologians Network. And I'm hosting here from the Water office, and my friend and colleague Laura Carprice is doing the IT for us, and she is a former Water intern, now a graduate student at George Mason University and living in Ottawa. So she's hosting us from Ottawa. Which tells you what the reach of this network is. We have people joining us, as I said, as we came into this program from Australia, for whom it's now 8 in the morning, folks in Europe who are really pushing their bedtime a little bit late for us, and every place in between. So I want to just welcome each and every one of you, and I want to thank Laura for stepping in and helping us with the IT. It makes a big difference. Water is located in Silver Spring, Maryland, and has been here since 1983. But we know that there's a rich history of this place from long before we got here. With a commitment to working for justice, we make this land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on indigenous land. Silver Spring, Maryland, where Water is located, is on the traditional and contemporary land of the Piscataway and Anacostan people, the original stewards of this territory. We're committed to making clear the names of these lands and the community members from these nations who reside alongside us and who have resided here long before we arrived. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country. We recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted Indigenous communities, communities of color, as well as immigrants and other people. We affirm the right of all people to bring their whole selves and their stories into this space. We confirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love for all people, and our commitment to caring for creation. I invite you, as we start this anniversary celebration event, to reflect on the original stewards of the land on which you stand or sit, as we begin our 25th Feminist Liberation Theologians Network gathering. Let us just take one moment of silence together to reflect in gratitude for the people on whose land we have the privilege of being. Join me in silence. A warm and grateful welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support for this program. Thank you for your participation, and thank you for your willingness to join with people from literally all over the world to look at issues of justice and how we as feminists in theology can bring our unique resources to trying to mitigate the violence and the injustice. Over the long years that this network has been going, we have typically met in conjunction with the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature annual meetings. But this year, the AAR-SBL annual meeting is hybrid. Participants in this meeting would have had to register and pay a fee, which we wanted to avoid to keep our meeting totally open. And that's why we set it up ourselves, and we set it up outside of the parameters of AAR-SBL so that we could, in fact, be together without any barriers of finance to anyone. We also this year, as for many years, are participating in collaboration with the American Academy of Religion Women's Caucus, several members of which are with us, including Elaine, who's one of our presenters. Their session is called AV 20-236, which is AAR speak. In English, it means that next Saturday, the 20th, from 12:30 to 2:30 Eastern Time, they will be dealing with the topic of re-engaging praxis, a call to action, with 3 very interesting papers to which I will offer a brief response. And that's how we collaborate. They come to this meeting and are part of the participant pool for this meeting, and we go to their meeting, some of us and anyone who wishes to listen to their papers and then Several times I have been privileged to give a response to them, and those papers will be given by Mi-Ann Tron. She'll be talking about From My Lai to Ferguson. A second paper will be presented by Haley Feuerbacher, The Economics of Purity and Marriage. And a third paper by Christine Pei, War on COVID-19. So I want to thank the Women's Caucus of the AAR for now many years of collaboration. I must say, you know, we collaborate with a lot of people, but these people are so easy to work with and so delightful and so responsive and so responsible doing their part that I just want to thank them at this anniversary time and hope that we can collaborate with them for many years to come. So especially for those of you who are new, what is the Feminist Liberation Theologians Network? What does it do? Well, it does have this annual meeting where we get together. There's a Google list of information that goes out during the year. We keep the list. You're on it unless you tell us you don't want to be. And we send a follow-up to this event once we have your email so that you can assume that you're on that list and you'll be getting information. And please feel free to use that Google list. Post relevant events, issues, articles, concerns, research, opportunities, activism. Feel free to use that list as your own. FLTN is sponsored by Water, the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual, and Water is supported by people like you. Our belief is that we want to socialize resources, so we keep our work simple, we welcome everyone without fees, and of course, we welcome your financial contributions. I can say that our donors for Water are very generous. So if you can donate, we need your donation and we appreciate it. If you cannot donate, you're just as welcome, knowing that, as we say here at Water, among us, there's enough. I repeat, among us, there's enough. If you can help, fine. If you can't, you are just as welcome. It's your presence. The resources will take care of themselves. And they do, by some miracle, I have no idea. But we're very grateful to communities and individuals and others who support the work of Water so that it can be open to everyone. I think that's an unusual approach, but it has worked for us for almost 40 years. So I can say I think it's there's something useful about it. Please look at our website, www.waterwomensalliance.org, for other water programs, including, as I mentioned, Monday night's Cauldron of the Kaliak meditation with Phoebe Knopf. And then on Wednesday next week, we will have Moravian University professor Kelly Denton-Borlung with her new publication entitled, And Then Your Soul is Gone, Moral Injury and U.S. War Culture. Moral Injury and U.S. War Culture. So those are just two of the upcoming programs. Let me turn then to FLTN. In 1995, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and I convened a gathering of theologians and activists at the Women's Ordination Conference meeting entitled Discipleship of Equals, Breaking Bread, Doing Justice. Elizabeth, by the way, was thwarted by technology and is not going to be with us today as far as I know. The next year, in 1996, we floated a proposal and invitations to bring US and Canadian people together, to link across racial ethnic lines, to explore and connect what other groups like this might exist around the world. And we started from a Christian starting point, but with the intention of and the active engagement of people from various world religious traditions. 25 years later, today, we still have much work to do in those four goal areas of the US Canadian people, the links across racial ethnic lines, the connections with other groups, and of course, working with people from a variety of religious traditions. We have a lot of work to do, but I think we can rejoice together, and I hope you are rejoicing, in having produced some very exciting sessions. Many of you were part of those. We've brought together many colleagues. I estimate that the network has gathered, some of us, of course, are repeat offenders, but more than 1,000 people. If you figure 25 years and 50 people a year, sometimes there have been more. The meetings don't include people who then have watched the videos, which are always on the Water website, subsequent to the event, or used them for their classes. The numbers don't take account of some of us who've been at many of the meetings, as I say, but others who've been there. So that's a pretty good number for a niche market like feminist liberation theology. We still have work to do, I emphasize that, which is the reason for today's event and for your active participation being solicited. You might want to put in the chat, and feel free to use the chat here. If we don't get to everything in the chat, we'll certainly download it and make it part of the report. But feel free to put in the chat if this is your first meeting, or you might, if you can think of it, how many meetings have you been to? That would be fun to see. I'm going to brag. I have perfect attendance, but I know that others have been to many. I should get the perfect attendance medal, but many others have been to many of these over the years. And I just think it's fun to see. It would be fun to see in the chat how many people have been to, say, this is their first, most welcome. Those who've been to, say, 2 or 3 or 5, feel free to say that. I have one regret today, and that is that we're not in person with champagne, as would befit the occasion. But then some of you would not have been in San Antonio if we had decided to do this at the AAR SBL. So you, all of you who are on this, are the happy trade-off for champagne. And I think it's well worth it. Let me then turn to our agenda. I'm going to speak in the briefest way about FLTN's history, and then our 3 speakers will in fact offer their reflections. Once they've finished, we'll go into small groups, and you'll have an opportunity to do the kind of introducing to one another in the group that has always been such an important part of what we're doing. That's why I ask you to put in your name, place, where you're from, and even a word about yourself if you want to, your pronouns if you care to, and any other explanatory words about yourself, because we can introduce ourselves that way rather than going around the circle, which is always so much fun, but it's really cumbersome on Zoom. But in the small groups, you'll get acquainted with at least 4 other people selected randomly to be with you, and we'll ask ourselves the same questions that I have asked of the speakers. And we'll put this up so you don't have to remember it, but what's the impact of FLTN in your vision? What do you see our impact as having been? What have you found personally most useful? And what do you think we should do moving forward? Those will be the 3 things we'll talk about in the groups. And again, they'll be in the chat. You can always refer to them, but it'll really be the same question that our speakers will be asked. What's been the impact of FLTN? What have you personally found most useful? And what do you think we should do moving forward? And then after we finish those small groups, we'll have a closing plenary session. We will end at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That means an hour and a half is the limit of this meeting. We'll pool our insights and we'll try to sketch a bit of a plan. At that point, we'll close officially, though you're welcome to hang out and chat with people if you wish, and we encourage you to do that. But I just want you to know that there's a hard end time to this, so we don't take the rest of your morning or your afternoon or now into your evening, depending on where you are. I want to also offer a special thanks to the students of Professor Kirk Nolan. Professor Nolan teaches an undergraduate course at Presbyterian College in Clinton, South Carolina. Several years ago, he told me, he brought students, and I remember them, to one of our in-person meetings. And he reported to me that his bringing those students to the meeting had a deep impact on their lives. They really learned some things at the meeting. Isn't that lovely to know? And so he said, do you think I could bring some students this time? I couldn't have been happier to say yes. So a special welcome to the undergraduate students. I believe there are 6 of you from Presbyterian College in Clinton, South Carolina. And thank you, Professor Nolan, for bringing them with you. So we begin. Please feel free to use the chat, as I said, and we will download it. This is being recorded. If you would prefer not to be recorded, because the recording will be shared, it will be on our website, please just take off your video and take down your name and stay where you are. But we'll, if you don't want to be in the video, that's okay. I want to just give a very brief overview of FLTN. Laura, if you'd be so kind as to put that document up on the screen. I just want to give an overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to the speakers. This is the chronology that I sent out recently for your viewing pleasure, and you can have a copy of this as well. We'll send it with the report. I'm not going to rehearse all of this except to say that we started in 1995, as I mentioned earlier, and we have come all the way to 2021 with 25 sessions in all. I want to simply make 3 overgeneralized comments, but just to kind of orient, especially people for whom this is a new experience. In terms of the Feminist Liberation Theologians Network, I can make these 3 comments. 1, participants have always been scholars and activists. They've been professors, students, ministers, rabbis, and other religious professionals. They've been activists in the various justice issues we have taken on, including in ecology, sexual and domestic violence, to name just a few. They've been artists and musicians. I think in a particular way of the late Katie Cannon, who made a marvelous presentation for us speaking about her art. The second thing I would say in general is that the content has consistently been critical analysis and self-critical reflection. We've looked at economic, political, pedagogical, ecological, and related issues over the long years. We have deconstructed feminism, liberation, and theology to a fare thee well. We fairly almost deconstructed ourselves in all of this, but it's been very useful to try to understand what it is that we're doing in our various places around the world. And the third thing I can say is that we have sought to bring diverse speakers and participants to reflect on intersectional concerns with attention to global involvement and global implications. And we have looked at the concrete ways in which those people are engaged, whether they're looking at successful educational programs, intersectional political work, locally based action efforts, teaching in the classroom. We've done this before and even now during COVID. And this has been, I think, an exercise in feminist liberation theology worldwide. Lots more to do, but so delighted that you're part of it today. It's now for our three speakers to assess what this means. I have asked them to reflect on what they think the impact of FLTN is, what they have personally found useful, and what they think we should do moving forward. Once we hear from them, we'll move into the small groups, as I mentioned, to ask the same questions of ourselves. The goal here is not to be laudatory or self-congratulatory, though we can all, I believe, take pride in persisting in this work against myriad odds. Rather, the goal at 25 is to begin to sketch out where this work goes next and how we and others might accomplish it. We won't finish that work today, but I hope we'll surface enough insights and interested people to keep the conversation going. Now let me introduce our speakers, and we'll hear from experts about what they think about this. Our three speakers will be in this order: Tracy West, who comes to us from Drew University, Kath Mcphillips from the University of Newcastle in Australia, and Elaine Nogedja, who will be with us from Methodist Theological School in Ohio. Elaine Nogedja Godse. Let me start with Tracy West in a brief introduction. Tracy West is one of the best-known members of our field, an activist scholar who serves as professor of Christian ethics and African American studies at Drew University, at the theological school there in New Jersey in the US. Her teaching, research, and activism have focused on gender, racial, and sexual justice, especially related to gender violence, which she spoke about at FLTN in 2014. And that gives me a chance to remind you that all of, or most of these meetings have been taped, audio, video taped, and can be found on the FLTN page of our website. So you can go and actually watch these. You can, I believe Tracy's from 2014 is there. Tracy has taught in community settings ranging from churches to a New Jersey women's prison. She's an ordained minister as well as a scholar, pastor, and activist in the United Methodist Church, where she works for full inclusion of LGBTIQ+ people in that denomination. Among her many publications are Wounds of the Spirit, Black Women, Violence, and Resistance Ethics in 1999, Disruptive Christian Ethics, When Racism and Women's Lives Matter in 2006, and her most recent book, which I highly recommend, Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality, Africana Lessons on Religion, Racism, and Ending Gender Violence in 2019. That was the subject of a water talk you can listen to online, and in my view is one of the most important contributions to our common work. Welcome, and thank you, Tracy West.
Thank you so much. It is a real honor, and I think I would like to start by saying thank you, Mary Hunt. If you ask me what has personally inspired me about this network and about water, I would say it in 2 words, Mary Hunt. So I just have to say thank you for the smart, persevering, and bold leadership model that you have been for me and for others. And if you have not seen Mary Hunt stand up, this is just one example, stand up to evil, particularly when it's expressed by certain kinds of Catholic authority leaders. You have not seen what it means to take on evil fearlessly and hyper articulately. So I thank you for the many ways you have allowed this network to continue. And so I just have a few brief remarks. I want to say that this Feminist Liberation Theologians Network is legendary for its innovation, its relevance, and its capaciousness in a world context that too often insists on shrinking, narrowing, limiting what we can know and imagine in relationship to spiritual, intellectual, embodied, and political bonds of unfreedom. Here in the United States right now, the ever widening and more successful movement for the state to ban the teaching of the enduring and impactful legacy of systemic white racism is a case in point. To ban that teaching of systemic white racism, supposedly to protect white children from being upset, is being passed in states from New Hampshire, has been passed in states from New Hampshire straight through Florida, has already been passed. And it's a case in point of the narrowing and limiting of what we can know and imagine and understand about unfreedom. So I'm honored to join this panel of amazing colleagues to celebrate 25 years of this network's existence. Allow me to use as my scripture a quote. I'm just going to excerpt a poem from, if I could create a canon, a scripture canon, I would put this poem in. It's a classic book called This Bridge Called My Back, 1981, and it's The Welder by Sherry Moraga. And it says, I am a welder, not an alchemist. I am interested in the blend of common elements to make a common thing. No magic here, only the heat of my desire to fuse what I already know exists is possible. We plead to each other. We all come from the same rock. We all come from the same rock, ignoring the fact that we bend at different temperatures, that each of us is malleable up to a point. I'm skipping to the end. I am now coming up for air. Yes, I am picking up the torch. I am the welder. I understand the capacity of heat to change the shape of things. I am suited to work within the realm of sparks out of control. I am the welder. I am taking the power into my own hands, unquote. Over the past 25 years, this network has taken the power into its own hands by mapping the meanings of feminist liberation. It has given voice to the vision of what might be understood as what is shared in common. I feel like that poem helps represents what I understand this network to have been concerned with at its very heart, providing specificity and contextuality that reveals the differences in that common vision. It has stressed a cross-generational mode of conversation that's flavored the gatherings with both deliciously fresh, brand new, and very seasoned insights all mixed up together. Pioneers of feminist studies and religion, pioneers of feminist activism in religion in local communities have conveyed their analyses of what is needed to provoke more, deeper, bolder views alongside of newer leaders framing their own questions and agendas of what is needed. The work of this group has been intentionally transnational, with perspectives on feminist liberation consistently offered by scholar activist leaders from a range of nation states beyond the US center that can so easily become the exclusive focus at meetings that are hosted by the US. And I think this network needs to continue and do more of that, much more of that. I think this network needs to have many, many more scholars from the continent of Africa, scholar activists from the continent of Africa in its transnational work that it is so committed to. Perhaps the most impactful dimension that especially inspires me has been the ways in which it has unabashedly claimed space for the centering of the urgency of the political moment. Feminist liberationist conversations, and for me, Black feminist liberationist conversations must continue to reject academic universalisms, pseudo-objectivity, and pseudo-dispassionate critical lenses, and instead make every step of our work immersive in particularity. From Occupy Wall Street to post-war Bosnia-Herzegovina, to Jewish Voices for Peace, Israel, Palestine, to Black Lives Matter, and much more throughout its history, Feminist Liberation Theologians Network has claimed that space of the urgency of the political as the center of its work, of its energy, of its vision, and the ways in which we can, in fact, connect together to do the transformation, to fulfill the transformational goals that we have. Time. There are questions of time. Decolonial work is simply about time. The kind of intersectional support for violence in particular, I spend a lot of time thinking about violence. The intersectional support for the kinds of resources that we have has to think through this kind of decolonizing understanding of time. What are the voices and paradigms that need remembering, that need honoring? And what are the repeated patterns among us through time? Did you hear that? What are the repeated patterns among us that need disrupting because they obstruct our vision of transformation? Often we're afraid of looking at those differences because we think it will destroy us, but we need those tools. And this is a network where we can create the tools where we can do that kind of confrontation of the patterns among us, especially related to racism and sexuality and nation and gender and class. In addition to continuing the focus on the boundaries and borders that need to be crossed, what are the alliances that we have built that are simply too fragile, that are simply too superficial, frankly, and need more honest and deeper confrontation of differences? I conclude with a riff on Moraga. We are the welders. Mary, I hope you're picking up on all of this heat and fire as a contrast to water, or perhaps even a partner with water. We are the welders taking power into our own hands. Thank you.
Tracy West, I can't thank you enough. I know I speak for everyone that you have started us off with a kind of analysis that I had only dreamed of, and I particularly was taken by the specificity of your remarks. And when you started to name those various issues, I know they come out of the reports, and you remind us that we have been very concrete about this, and that has taken us in new directions, and it has taken us deeper, and it might even have been a little bit helpful. So I thank you, and I thank you for your participation, and especially for your wisdom and insight. Let's move on to Kath Mcphillips. By my rendering, we have about a dozen countries represented. I may have missed a few, but we have at least a dozen countries represented, and they are all represented with the same kind of intensity and insight as Tracy West has just exhibited, and Kath Mcphillips will now follow. Kath is a senior lecturer in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Newcastle in Australia. She's a sociologist of religion and gender. She employs feminist, psychoanalytic, and sociological frameworks to issues around gender and religion, particularly around child sexual abuse in religious organizations. Kath has extensive experience in attending, reporting on, and analyzing the Catholic Church at the Royal Commission on Institutional Child Sexual Abuse, and has had numerous research grants to do that and other forms of her work. And as Tracy made reference to my own, I think she called it boldness with regard to certain Catholic officials. My most recent piece, by the way, synod or synodly, with reference to with a bow to Mary Daly for synodly, but one has to call these things out, and Kath Mcphillips does this and has done this with particular attention to the sex abuse criminality in Australia. Her most recent publications are in Child Abuse and Neglect, Feminist Theology, Journal of Australian Studies, Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and the Journal for the Academic Study of Religion. Kath was part of a recent Water Talk with our dear colleague Naomi Goldenberg from Ottawa on a book they did together entitled The End of Religion, Feminist Reappraisal of the State. It's a very provocative, insightful volume. I highly recommend it. Kath also spoke at this meeting last year, and I invited her again because I appreciate so much her blend of social scientific studies with theology and religion. Her social location in Australia, of course, means we get solid insights from that part of the world. And I say to you, good morning and 1,000 welcomes, Kath. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was a beautiful welcome, and thank you so much, Tracy. That was just an incredible, scintillating analysis. I feel like you've let me off the hook a bit because you've covered so many of those issues so well. So thank you. I'm just going to begin with an acknowledgement of country, and to let you know that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Awabakal people in the mid-north coast of Eastern Australia, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I acknowledge that this land has never been ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I thank the elders and people for allowing me to live on this land, this beautiful land, and to speak from it. So I'm going to take a very different track to Tracy's. I wanted to use my time to reflect on the importance of FLTN as a networking community. And I wanted also to acknowledge the debt that I owe to this network in fostering my own work over the last 25 years, more broadly to building the network in Australia and Oceania. And I hope that by sharing my story, I could encourage you to share your story of FLTN and of network building and how important it is to our work. So as Tracy has said, it's very clear we know that FLTN from its earliest days is focused on the worldwide connections amongst women. And in large part, this is due to the work of Mary and Elizabeth. They're just incredible networkers themselves, and they're just the most generous mentors of women, working in that connection between religion and social justice within and beyond the Academy. So I'm incredibly grateful to the opportunities for growth and connection that the network has provided for me, in terms of alliances and just encouraging change and also restoring hope. So I hope by sharing my story that it might sort of spark in you the importance of this network. So I learned the importance and power of networking as a young woman. In my undergraduate years in the early 1980s, I was very involved with the National Catholic Students Movement in Australia. In fact, I worked for the movement for 2 years, which included visits to the international office in Paris, And there I had the privilege of working alongside Catholic students from across the world. And it was a very incredible time. And I also learnt my feminism within the Catholic Church, which is a fact that my secular feminist friends never believe, but it's true. And in the heady days of post-Vatican II, the 1980s was a very dynamic time in Australian Christian feminism. And we made substantial inroads into the ordination debates, liturgical language, and the status of women in Christian churches. So that there was a huge amount of activity that built around this time. Multiple groups formed, including the Sydney Women Church Group, ordination movements in the Catholic and Anglican Church, churches, and a National Catholic Women's Association called WATAC. Goddess groups were also springing up, and we held multiple feminist theology conferences where we were exploring our commonalities and differences with a focus on improving the status of women in religious traditions. So we were engaged in feminist social activism, but not only in building alliances, but in what Grace Jansen, the great UK British feminist theologian, has called the feminist religious imaginary, where we were able to imagine new forms of community fostered by the wonderful feminist theologies that were being published, mostly from the US, the authors of whom we were really keen to know. So throughout the 80s, the 90s, and into the early 2000s, we had really important visitors to Australia, including Mary Daly, Carol Criss, Jacqueline Grant, Carter Hayward, Mary Hunt, and Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza, whose book In Memory of Her had been widely read by Australian women in Australia and had radicalised many of us to the potential of feminist theology. And we grabbed that concept of kyriarchy and we saw how it was enacted in Australian religious contexts. Every visit provided opportunities for us to rethink politics and ideas, and it was incredibly stimulating. So by 1990, I was a postgraduate student in social anthropology, studying the women church movement, and I undertook an ethnography of the Sydney Women Church Group, of which I was a member from the late 1980s to when it wrapped up in 2007. So my research work was coming out of my lived experience as a Catholic feminist and a social justice worker and an academic. While I was deeply connected to the feminist reform movements in Australia, I was also seeking a wider intellectual community and the experience of feminist activism in religion. And I was really keen to meet the authors whose work I was reading. So I first travelled to the US in 1993 to attend the Women Church Convergence meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I was just completely blown over by the sheer numbers of women who were gathering compared to our small groups in Australia. And I was able to listen really carefully to US feminist religious activism, which had very different inflections and issues to that in Australia. I met Diane New and Mary Hunt for the first time. And from Albuquerque, I went to Harvard Divinity School, where I stayed for a month. And as part of my research, I did a series of recorded interviews with Elizabeth, who was, of course, incredibly generous with her time and knowledge. And it was just a very rich and stimulating time. And then I first attended the AAR and FLTN in 1999 in Boston, and remember clearly Mary and Elizabeth presiding over a group of women as we shared our stories of feminist action in our lives and work. And then throughout the 2000s, I returned for the AAR and FLTN meetings when I could, and I was lucky enough to be invited to the 20th anniversary celebrations for the Journal of Feminist Studies of Religion at Harvard in 2005. This is an amazing week where I was just hanging out with many feminist scholars, many of them whose work I was very inspired by. The Sydney-based group led by Patricia Brennan, the wonderful Patricia Brennan, the Australian Feminist Theology Foundation set up a fund to support feminist theologians to attend conferences. So I brought with me to that conference Dr. Lee Niana-Sky, who's the first Indigenous womanist scholar whose doctoral thesis had just been conferred. And I saw Lee have the same experience that I had had 10 years before with the power of networking. Soon after that, Lee became the first Indigenous Australian woman to hold a postdoc position at Harvard Divinity School. So you can see how important this networking is. As time went on, more Australians began travelling to the US for the AAR and the FLTN meetings, including, amongst others, Elaine Wainwright, Coralie Ling, Anne Elvey, and more recently, Tracy McKeown. And from that small beginning in the early 1990s, there's now an expansive group of Aussie women And it's been a powerful pathway to share our stories of change and challenge. The tyranny of distance has always been an issue, meaning most of us can't attend every year. But I so appreciated it when I could. And I so appreciated that Mary and Elizabeth were flourishing, doing the work of nourishing FLTN. And, you know, behind that was the solidness of water. So the FLTN has been both a very warm and inviting place, but also a place to be challenged. I felt very connected to the women around the world, firming relationships with colleagues and friends, sprouting new ideas, being exposed to the multiple stories of women across many feminist platforms. And the simple structure of listening to reflections by panelist speakers on often urgent issues and then having time to share thoughts with others has really worked consistently over the years. But on reflecting for this exercise, it's become really clear to me that attending the annual meeting is just one moment in time of the life of FLTN. So I see FLTN as a deep root system traveling across an expansive area. It's a dynamic, moving, generous, safe space, which enjoys a physical presence once a year at the AAR SBL, but it has multiple shoots that bring people together across a whole range of projects and ideas. So, for example, the last time I was at the FLTN was in San Diego in 2019, and there I met Australian and New Zealand theologians whose work was new to me. And also I got some very significant insights from US and German feminists into the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. The focus on activism and social justice around contemporary issues formed by feminist ideas is just a very, very powerful combination. I've tried to hand on the legacy of FLTN to those around me, particularly in Australia and more broadly in Oceania. I've brought with me my postgraduate students. Tracy McEwen is here today, I think, in the meeting. So, you know, that's been a great thing to be able to do, and of course to meet with my colleagues. But in my mind, just to wrap up, the role of the FLTN, I think, is to nourish our spirits, our work, our politics, our thinking, to bring us together at multiple nodes and sites, to foster the feminist religious imaginary in all its difference and complexity. And I think now, you know, Tracy has spoken very well about the urgent tasks that are ahead of us. But I agree, and I think we have to find ways to continue to support the work that we're doing in and around vulnerable communities. And how can we keep connected in a post-pandemic world? And I guess one thing that the pandemic has taught us is that we can meet virtually and connect. We can continue our work and build the network. So I feel very hopeful that the network will keep expanding and moving forward in its simple but brilliant way of bringing women together to share their experiences and insights. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. That's why I invited you, because you have such a broad scope of things and you have such a deep insight into both the social and the religious components. I'm also thrilled that you mentioned the feminist religious imaginary and the name Grace Jansen. I bow my head in respect to her. She was one of the great British Canadian, I guess one could say, scholars and activists in her own way. She also was a contributor to the Good Sex volume that Patty Jung and I and others put together, and we had the wonderful experience of working with her. And what a brilliant and committed woman she was. I'm sorry, another one like Dr. Cannon that we have lost rather prematurely in our work. I appreciate your insights, and I really am excited about how you're replicating some of the dynamics of this work in your region, and I think you help to give us a real incentive of how we can move along in terms of both the nourishing and the specificity of the issues that Tracy brought us. So I think your presentations have gone together so brilliantly. I now invite another colleague to join us, Elaine Nogeda Godsi, and I'm using Elaine rather than we would say Elaine in English, but it's important, I think, to use the Portuguese pronunciation Elaine. She is assistant professor of theology, ecology, and race at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, Methesco. She's recovering from an accident, so she may not be on screen, but we told her just to lie however she can be comfortable, she's welcome to present. She works on intersecting decolonial and ecofeminist perspectives. She studies Black, Brown, and Indigenous women's experiences of religion, gender, and sexuality connected to climate change, environmental racism, food justice, and immigration. Elaine is originally from Brazil, and she has lived for 15 years in South Africa before she came here to the US. She wrote her doctoral dissertation in South Africa on the ecofeminist theology of Ivone Gebara. Ivone was signed up today. I don't know if she's with us, but on Ivone Gebara, the great Brazilian theologian who may be with us today. Elaine worked as a postdoctoral research fellow in the Institute for Comparative Religion in Southern Africa, where she coordinated the research project Southern Knowledge, jointly hosted by the Network for Religion and Education Project, and a program in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Cape Town. She has long collaborated and is now co-chair of the Women's Caucus team of the American Academy of Religion. You remember at the outset I talked about those people being our main collaborators in this work. And if you look at their diverse programming, including the session I mentioned next Saturday on re-engaging praxis, a call to action, you will see a deep overlap with Feminist Liberation Theological Network's concerns. And Elaine is one of the people who is a bridge there. Among her publications is a very important chapter actually in a book called Tangible Actions Toward Solidarity, an ecofeminist analysis of women's participation in food justice. It's a book, the book is entitled Valuing Lives, Healing Earth, which is edited by Lillian Dubé, Teresa Hinga, and several others, Teresa Ugar. And it's a wonderful book put together with attention to the work of Rosemary Radford Ruther. Another one of her articles is Toward a Decological Praxis, DECOLOGICAL, not ecological, but decological praxis. Elaine is assistant editor for the Journal of the Study of Religion, Religion, Nature, and Culture, and she's currently working on a book which I can't wait for, called Rethinking Ecofeminism and Religion, a Decolonial Perspective, and needless to say, there'll be a water program on that. So we welcome you as a dear colleague to FLTN, and we count on many more years of collaboration with the Women's Caucus. Elaine, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for this warm welcome. It's so nice to see so many faces. Tracy, so nice to see you. I wish I could just hug you all and be with you. But I'm so glad that Tracy and Kathleen are so concise and they spoke less than Mary asked us so that I can speak more. Mary,
well, actually, I'm gonna warn you. We're already going to be pushing it in terms of having time for small groups. So
that's cool.
Follow their lead. Follow their lead.
You tell a Brazilian woman to speak concise.
I know.
That doesn't
happen. Just go ahead and speak your words.
So I would like to reflect on the role that the Feminist Liberation Theologians Network has played and offer some suggestions on moving forward. As in my role as the co-chair representing today is the Women's Caucus of the ARSBL, but more so by sharing my own story and relationship with the FLTN. And in 2016, I proposed to deliver a paper titled Postcolonial Imaginations of a Feminist Liberation Methodology in the Women's Caucus session at the ARSBL annual conference in San Antonio. I learned later that this was a collaboration session between the Women's Caucus and Feminist Liberation Theologians Network, and that I was invited to attend the FLTN meeting, which usually takes place one day before the caucus session. The speakers were asked to briefly incorporate our takeaway from the FLTN meeting in our own papers, and were informed that Mary Hunt would be responding to our sessions. I was so nervous. And so some of those FLTN speakers were also invited to do the same and attend the caucus. I was even more nervous. But this format has proved to be so life-giving, and it is one which we currently use. So I don't think I have shared this with Mary before, but the 2016 AAR annual meeting represents a water divide in my academic career. This was not only because I had just 5 days before the meeting moved my family from South Africa where I lived for 19 years to the American Midwest in Ohio, so that I could start my current position. It was also not because Donald Trump had just won the presidential elections and people keep asking me if his victory would make me regret accepting that position. But in addition to those factors, the 2016 AAR meeting represented a water divide because through the collaboration between the Women's Caucus and the Fltn, I could listen to Nam Kim speaking about survival at no one else's expense. I'm just going to repeat this. Nam Kim's paper was titled Survival at No One's Expense, Forging an Intersectional Coalition. It's interesting how these things work. I had been researching and writing for years on feminist liberation theology and its intersection with ecofeminism and post-colonial theory. But it was through Nam's words that the coin flipped. Everything connected, and I thought, that's it. I am part of a system. We all are part of this system, which hierarchical dualism manifests today through ideological formations of colonial thinking. And I thought there is this dominator-subordinated dynamics, which has made possible for us to organize our societies through people surviving at the expenses of others' survival. Well, in the next day, I delivered my paper, which was focused on course on Ivone Gebara's feminist liberation theological trajectory. Cannot leave that part out, but very timidly and very briefly, I mentioned the overlooked colonizing form of dialogue that male liberation theologians displayed when they completely missed the point and resisted to include gender and sexuality as category of analysis to liberation theology on the grounds that would take the focus away from the oppressed and marginalized. After our presentations, we had a round table dialogue instead of the formal Q&A, and I could dialogue with women in my own field who cared about the same kind of research than me. And I received the most constructive feedback from Mary Hunt and Kim. And Mary pointed out this. She pointed out, but wait a minute, there's that part that you just passed by. You mentioned something about male liberation theology. What was that again? And it was that curiosity that I thought, okay, maybe I should investigate this better. But just let's pause that information for a second. So soon after the AAR, I was invited to be one of the speakers in the Journal for the Feminist Study of Religion conference that took place at Drew University in 2017. It was Nam Kim who suggested my name to the organizers. And it was in that conference that Mary Hunt introduced me to Judith Plasko. And one of my younger postgraduate student dreams came to pass. I was invited by Judith Plasko to have lunch and discuss my ideas on the colonial praxis. Oh, I couldn't believe. It was also in that meeting that I introduced myself to Rebecca Alpert, my academic grandmother, and I met Tracy West. In that conference, I made so many most meaningful academic friendships. I met Jackie Hidalgo and Juliana Hammer, which we good friends. And I was still feeling dizzy from the entire migration process, from finding out that I was in the last 10 years in an interracial marriage, and I didn't know that, but Americans made sure to clarify that for me. But it was there that Laurel Carnes and Cynthia Molobida invited me to go for a beer. I knew that I had to go, although I was so tired. But it was over that beer that I shared with them that my mother committed suicide when I was only 11 years old. I could also in that meeting listen to their stories and share the wounds. I was comforted by their stories. I had an entirely new level of respect and looking up to those women. For that conference, I began sketching this idea of a decological way to dialogue. Now, decological is a term that I conceptualized while rethinking my ecofeminist pedagogical methods to teach about religion ecology in the Midwest. It is also like a scholarly methodology for guiding dialogue between Western and non-Western feminists and ecofeminists and those in religious studies and theology in the global North and South. Dialogue became the basis for cooperatively addressing the shared realities of climate change, coloniality, and the impact of both. I have a lot that I could say about this ecological praxis, but let me just pass here. Favorite sentence that people say in conferences, anyway. So, since I heard Nam Kim speaking at the Fltn about survival at no one's expenses, and decolonization in conjunction with de-imperialization in the imperial center, I understood that one of today's biggest ecological challenges involves learning how to survive not at the expense of somebody else's survival. This notion has influenced my research interests, permeated my teaching style and my own spirituality, and progressed to shape my own vocation and voice. I am today, it's one of my aims at in every course that I teach, at developing methods that can create a space where my students can develop compassion with clear seeing, instead of become guilt and miserable. Naturally, as feminist scholars, we explore pedagogical methodologies that encourage our students to challenge systemic structure of powers, such as patriarchy and colonialism. We encourage them to dismantle dualism by becoming aware of its existence. But there are not many of us who have gone further and attempted to exemplify what this awareness looks like in practice. I would like to suggest that one way forward to the Feminist Liberation Theological Network is through cultivating dialogue practices that extricates colonial paradigms and assumptions from our scholarly dialogue. Of course, by that, I'm also advertising a little bit my own work, my publications, and my forthcoming book, but, well, Mary created those opportunities, you had to take it. So, so it is through this thinking about dialogue that I have proposed to my students to create a beloved community that could bring students of color and white students into dialogue through practicing deep listening and learning from each other's experiences. I explained to them that when they are reading a text by an author from a different culture, then their own culture, they should enter that conversation by holding the values of openness and humility, being attentive to the parts that the buttons get pushed and use that as opportunity to learn more about themselves and their own experiences in this earth. This is opposed to gearing up and developing a defense of the perspectives. This is an attempt to construct a beloved community and a kind of dialogue that I have seen present many times in the meetings hosted by the Feminist Liberation Theological Network, one that opens the space for female and women-identifying scholars to be vulnerable as they share their stories through their scholarship during such a time where so much grief by those being oppressed, as well by those who their very existence promotes the oppression of others, independently of their awareness or intent, as they are also a cog in the machine created by systemic injustice. Okay, Mary, how am I going with time?
You're just about out. So if you can
just about out.
Great, and there'll be more time to discuss afterwards. So go ahead, finish up as quickly as you can.
Thank you, Mary. So I have found that proposing a ecological way to dialogue, which is the intersection between decolonial, ecological, feminist, and pedagogical conversations, bringing into the intersection, feminism, race, ecology, and religion. It's much like to what my husband used to describe our daughter's early teen years. He used to say, talking to Natalia is like driving a TNT truck in a bumpy road. So I have discovered that this intersection promotes much like that experience. But it's through dialogue with women from different cultures, religions, and economic privilege that I have experienced much love and kindness. It is through the network that it has been created in the Fltn, in the Women's Caucus, friendship, openness, opening of doors, mentorship, that I would like to uplift some of those very positive characteristics in such a time in which we are constantly being reminded about oppression and grief and so much of despair in this world. Thank you.
Obrigada.
De nada.
So delighted that you're with us, Elaine. I hope you will be feeling better. Those ribs will heal. And I really want to thank you for bringing Nami Kim's work to us, because I think you're absolutely right that her notion of survival without impinging upon the survival of other people is a signal insight in our field. Now, the love and kindness that you have experienced, you have already shared many times over. So thank you again. I want to turn now to, with great thanks to Tracy and Kath and Elaine, I want to turn now to the rest of us. What is it that we think is the impact of FLTN? What have you found personally useful? And what do you think we should do moving forward? Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good group, however many people were in it. And I hope that you had a good conversation. And please, I'm going to take 1 minute of our precious time to ask you to write something in the chat about what you thought about those questions. What about the impact? What have you found personally useful? And what should we do moving forward? So if we take 1 minute, that will be the equivalent of 45 minutes of work in 1 minute. So go at it. Get on the chat and put your answers to those questions. What's the impact? What have you found personally useful? And what do you think we should do moving forward? And don't feel the need to answer all of them, but please put something in the chat and we'll make sure that they're part of the report. So glad to have each and every one of you, and thanks to my own small group, that was a lovely gathering. So I'm counting seconds here for 1 minute in the chat. I see Susan Thistlethwaite typing. You know, she writes mystery novels now that are really marvelous, and so I'm sure she'll have some exciting things to say to us. And I see Evangeline. I hadn't seen you before. Great to have you. Monica Maher from Ecuador, great to have you. Janice Poss, good to see you. So wonderful to see so many people. Mary Gallione, Carrie, all people from water programs as well. It's great to see folks. Oh, Rosemary Ganley, Cub journalist at age 84. She's got her keys. Her keyboard is smoking. Go ahead, Rosemary. Keep it smoking there. Rosemary writes a weekly column for the Peterborough newspaper in Ontario she now has several volumes of her columns, weekly columns. Marta Lydia, qué bueno verte. Okay, we're almost to the end of our minute. And I apologize to Elaine that I have to worry about time.
No apologies. You did
Only because I can see my friends from Western Europe and they're beginning to fade, the poor darlings. It's late there. So now we're going to open the floor. With great thanks to each and every one of you for being part of this conversation. We're going to open the floor, and I'm going to beg your indulgence that we go 10 minutes over the hour, just so we can hear from a few people. So I will absolutely stop dead at 5:40. But if we can just have an extra 10 minutes, I think, since we didn't start quite on time, What I'd invite you to do is when you finish putting something in the chat, try to bring these comments now in the closing to commonalities or trends or concrete suggestions or concrete next steps. That's really what we want to do. We got a lot of orientation from speakers and from our small groups about things that need to be done. Africa, Caribbean, folks need to be involved here in a much more intentional way. We need probably to meet more than once a year. I mean, there's a lot of specifics, but let's hear from a few people. Janet Bourne, I see your hand up, and let's go from there. And please make your comment brief, say your name, where you're from, and keep it brief.
Janet Bourne from Ohio, USA. Just want to say, reaching across borders, and we're worldwide. That is so important. And it means so much to me. I think we learn so much listening to each other across our borders. Thanks, you.
Janet. Thank you. Who's next?
Making the connections between different movements, not only the feminist movement, but the climate movement, the peace movement, etc.
That's Renata Rose from Germany and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she's very active in the peace movement. Monica Maher from Ecuador, go ahead.
We also talked about the importance of listening to Indigenous women's voices. There's a whole Indigenous feminist theological movement, especially in Bolivia and Guatemala, and their insights are amazing. But it would mean having some translation. If we did Zoom, it's easy to do that. We could have like 3 languages and have simultaneous translation.
Thanks, Monica. That's absolutely right. Susan Thistlethwaite. Unmute, please.
Yeah, the importance our group was saying of the non-consumerist aspect of Feminist Liberation Theologians Network, as opposed to the consumption model of so many academic meetings. I also wanted to say, Tracy began with how white supremacy is trying to destroy the beloved community possibilities, that Eleni came back and said, through the reading of these diverse novels, building the beloved community. I mean, that is really the struggle today between the 2 speakers pointed it out so well, the deliberate attempt to destroy meeting minds that are different from you. And Eleni saying, that's the way forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Helpful insight. Ulrike, please, from East Berlin.
I put that East Berlin in while we were talking, because I realized once more that Eastern Europe is not taken into account. So when we talk about the global South, we do not talk about the global East. So I was born in East Berlin, was part of the peaceful revolution, and we are still marginalized. And so people are not aware in the global North and West about this problem. And we also have this work chain, so people from Eastern areas working in other parts in households, and we have even slaves, etc. So we have a lot which needs to be considered with the Eastern, I mean also including Eastern Europe. And we can tackle this when we bring together post-colonial, decolonial, and post-secular and genderqueer theory also, and bring closer what we do here, activism and theory. But I think, with Eastern Europe, this would also be a space which I also theorize in terms of post-coloniality, which could be considered here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Evangeline, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Mary. Just wondering whether FLTN can reinvent herself in a new way to be consistently prophetic and theologically, play that critical role by addressing these issues of priority through the year instead of, focusing on the AAR time. So to make use of Zoom opportunity to come together more often and, consistently kind of work on those issues of racism, sexism, patriarchy, and this time, yes, intentionally include climate justice issues too. Thank you.
Yeah, very helpful. I think that is something, a number of people, and you could wave your hands, those who are on other water programs throughout the year. There are lots of people who are on here who are on either the meditation program, the liturgy program, the water tea, or the water talk. So every month we have those programs. But the question is how to then take this focus and give it a more intentional, say, 3 times a year kind of meetings. And I think that's something that we need to think about. But we also need your help. We need some people to help us to do that because we're a small organization and we're almost, I would say, we're beyond our capacity given everything that needs to be done. So, but it's something that if we could get a little group together, I think we could make that happen 3 times a year without any sweat whatsoever. Elaine, you're next. Thank you, Evangeline.
Hey, Mary. I was wondering, like you asking us about ways to go forward, but I was really curious if you would tell us what were the things that you need, that water needs. Because for me, feminist liberation theologians are one of the few scholars that really know how to navigate interdisciplinary conversation that really brings like religious studies and theology together and feminism and so on without having all of those, oh, you're in religious studies, I'm in theology, or so are really scholars that have skills on how to navigate and they open to enter in conversation and to learn from each other. So we have a lot of tools, we have a lot of history, we have a lot to offer. And so I was just thinking, like, what are the things that you need to continue this work and to bring more, like, to continue this beautiful mentorship program that you have?
Yeah, well, that's really the focus today is what is it that we need going, not just what water needs, but what we need going forward. What are, and it's clear already that people are saying that they want more, that the international component is really important. And I think we would need to have a couple of people from different parts of the world who would commit to being in conversation to set those agendas, because it doesn't help for water to set the agenda. We've always set the agenda for the next year out of this conversation. We always take this conversation and then we say, oh, what does that suggest for what we might do in the future? So one of the things that would help us would be if there were a few people who would be part of that conversation in a regular way to help us move in that direction. Mary Condren has her hand up. Thank you, Elaine. We'll take that with great seriousness. Mary Condren, Ireland.
Yeah, I'm involved with another network called the Maternal Gift Economy, and over the past year and a half, we've put on many different events and Zooms and conferences at the intersection of Indigenous theory and maternal gift economy and thinking. And one of the things that I've come to kind of focus on is the need as a theologian to deconstruct religions of empire. It's as simple as that. How do we go about deconstructing the religions of empire? And it seems to me that that kind of focus would bring together a great deal. I'm also thinking of I don't regularly go to meetings of theologians, but I'm very involved in, things like the Association of Women in Mythology, which put on an extraordinary symposium this year online, absolutely brilliant. And with the work of the Goddess scholars, particularly coming out of the old European, which is the indigenous tradition of Europe. And that seems to me, it would have a great deal to offer to the work of theologians. So I would be hoping that there might be a lot more between this network and those kinds of networks that are doing very parallel work of great relevance to theology at this point. So that's my byline for the evening, at least: deconstruct the religions of empire.
Yeah, really helpful and very much what we're trying to do, Mary. I think in the individual work of people, but also what needs to be done as a theme or a topic for us. So thank you so much for that. And if you'd put in the chat those groups for people, the mythology group, the gift economy group, that would be very helpful as well. So
Okay.
that'll help. Folks, I have the unhappy task of being worried about the time, not wanting to extend this beyond what we had contracted, but to tell you that the Zoom will be open and conversation will continue even now that I'm going to close us in a formal way. Please send your suggestions. First of all, thank you. I mean, just beyond thank you to each and every one of you for being part of this, because it really wouldn't be if we weren't engaged in it. And I'm so happy for those for whom it's their first experience. I hope you will come back. I hope you feel as welcome as those who've been here for 20. We have, if you read in the chat, it's kind of fun. Some people have been here 20 times. Some people have been here 10 times. One of us has been here for 25 times. Some people, it's just, I think it's really exciting to see the nourishing of nourishers, as we said in my group, that those of us who do, all of us who do the work that we do, also need to be nourished. And we look to each other. Mary Condon and I were saying how we look to each other to nurture one another in this kind of work. And this is one of the places that does that. In addition to all of the scholarly work and the activism work, we also try to nourish one another. And I think that should not be underplayed or seen as somehow trivial or extra, but that should be seen as exactly what this work is about. You'll receive from us at Water a report of this meeting. I want you to feel free to use this video, especially the presentations, which I thought were 1, 2, 3 brilliant. Each one very helpful, very different, and very much overlapping in terms of the issues that they raised and the way that they raised them. So I want to thank again our speakers, Kath and Tracy and Elaine. I want to invite you once again to look at the Women's Caucus sessions. If you go into the AAR SBL program, you'll see that the Women's Caucus sessions are really very much along the lines of this, and you will learn a lot from those. I also take the point that was made that we no longer need be tethered to the AAR SBL as a place to meet, and that does give us a lot more freedom and flexibility for these kinds of sessions, and I take that point very seriously. I want to thank in a special way my friend and colleague Laura Carprice, who has jumped in here for technical support at a time when we very much needed her. And as I say, she's doing this from Ottawa, which I think is even more delightful. And I want to finally thank you and wish you a happy anniversary from Water for joining us. We'll see you next year, perhaps some of us in person in Denver, certainly online in some way. Meanwhile, use the Google list and consult our website, www.waterwomensalliance.org, for this video, and expect the report soon. Thank you. Stay well. Do justice. Happy anniversary.